Okay, we'll get things kicked off. Welcome everybody, those of you that, how many people have been here any of the other Revit user meetings? How many people, this is your first Revit user meeting? Fantastic, all right. So, welcome to the New York City Revit User Group. What the group is, I think current actual membership, we're pushing close to 200 now. It doesn't show here, obviously. I think tonight is like global open school night. I know that I have to split out of here in about half an hour to make sure I go with my kids open school night, which I neglected to ask my wife about, but that's a different story. Okay, has everybody here signed up for the Google group that we have for distribution? Does anybody know about that? Or you just got the email? All right. If you don't, take a look at the invite. I know I've been trying to. I can add people. I don't want to just like dump everybody into that Google group, but so it's open for sign up. If you want to go to that web address, groups.google.com/group/NYC-RUG. You can just sign up, and really, it's not really a discussion forum. What we'll do is. The best functionality, if you need to send out a message to everybody in the group, which I do for the invitations for these meetings, you can email nyc-rug@googlegroups.com. And anything, you just be careful that anything you send to that email address will get posted on that group website. So if you were like reply, if I send out a message and you reply back to that email, not you, I'm not pointing at you. So some people have done that in the past. Just be aware that it gets posted to the website. Okay. Agenda for today. Our image of the week, image of the month is one of the images in the Revit gallery on the Augie forums from Ski South. Yeah, that actually is a Revit and photograph composite up on top. People were astounded that wasn't an actual photograph, and this was just doctored up in Photoshop down below. So feel free to go on to the Augie gallery, the Revit gallery, and comment to Ski South. Announcements. Augie training program is ongoing. There's a lot more new Revit content either on the site or coming, so keep an eye on that all the time. We just had the Augie CAD matinee. Did anybody go to the CAD matinee out in Secaucus? No? I didn't go either. I'll have to get feedback from somebody that might find out. Augie CAD Camp is happening in Paramus on October 19th. That's more of a full day as opposed to the matinee being a half a day. Just to note that early registration ends on October 4th, so if you want to get like $30, $40, and get what it was off the registration price, get in by October 4th. Once again, my own little promo, continuing education. I teach Revit Professional, which is an evening class at NYU. Ask Chris Kammer right here. I'll pick on him tonight. He was a student, one of the first classes I taught. Those sessions start October 23rd. It's evenings, goes from about 6 to 9 o'clock, and it's pretty reasonable. It's like $700 something like that. And Imagine It, our guys from Imagine It and Roger from Microsoft continually offering CAD classes there. Now, topic of the season, Autodesk University coming up. It's filling up very, very, very fast. Is anybody going to Autodesk University? Everybody already signed up? A couple of people? Okay. What's special about this? It's the week right after the Thanksgiving holiday, back in Vegas again this year. They have an early bird discount that ends October 6th. You get $500 off the price of registration. I think it's like $1,500 or $1,900, one of the two. What's special about this? Members of this local, not specifically this one, but if you're a member of a local user group or a LUG, if three of anybody of you register, we get one free. So they can coordinate that through me, and then we'll distribute it to the group, or get a free in your company. We'll figure that out. But if you go in and you register, and you enter in either NYC RUG or New York City Revit User Group, if three of those get registered, then the group gets a free one. And they just put out a program for AU Online. That those of you that didn't attend last year, you can go on to the Augie website and get a 7-day free membership to AU Online, which is recordings of like 100 classes. My two classes got recorded, a bunch of others, all the handouts, so check that out. So I'll jump right into our presentation for the evening. I think it's all headed out here. From the factory, not a lot going on from the factory. They just wanted me to mention that Autodesk acquired RoboBat, structural analysis program. A couple of links for the month, which I'm sorry I neglected to put on the handout, but the guys that made Revit City just came up with a new website called BIM World. They're trying to like level the platform and offer content for SketchUp and Bentley and ArchiCAD and Revit all in one website. So we'll see how that goes. Check it out. If you're interested in some neat generative algorithmic design ideas, that we had a meeting with a gentleman recently who has a website called armyofclerks.net. Some cool stuff there. Just good eye candy, good if you're interested in that kind of thing. But feel free to check it out. So I'm going to turn it over to our guest speaker tonight. Steve Stafford is he and I go way back. He's one of the quote unquote early adopters, the Mavericks who kind of jumped on the Revit bandwagon. I think since what, Revit 1.0 or before that? Well, he used it.
I couldn't talk to the firm and paying for it until full.
Yeah. That was like a rental program. So anyway, Steve was in town. He's a trainer. He just told me tonight that he actually does not work for literally for CDB Systems, Service Delays Company, but he kind of does private freelancing for him. So he's kind of on his own doing a rock star thing. So Steve does great classes and labs on family creation at AU. So I asked him to come, and I know he's prepping as I am for my classes this year at AU. So I said, you're in town, why don't you come along, have some food, and give us a little snippet of your class on family creation. So he's gracious enough to accept. I told him he couldn't eat unless he came and gave a presentation. So I'll hand it over to Steve Stafford. Thanks.
Actually, you said that I could only come if I did.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Steve Stafford. Since I'm a Revit guru, I'm uncomfortable with that definition.
You still have mute on.
If I can wear it, you can be the judge whether it fits or not. It's still blue. Good, John. I should move really close and turn the gain up and something. So, can you give me a sense of where you guys are? How many of you guys are using Revit on a day-to-day basis on projects? Some of you. How many of you have never used Revit? One or two? And how many of you are in my class right now? Couple. I don't know, Esteban, can I say where I'm working right now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. The folks at BBG have hired Autodesk to do their training, and it's an ongoing thing for the last year or so, right? Or 8 months. And one of Autodesk's top-notch guys, Phil Reed's been doing their training at their office, and he got double booked. So Autodesk called me and asked me if I could come in and step in. So I've been doing training at their office for last week and this week, and I'll be there again first week of October, second week of October as well. And as James was saying, when I first started out doing training, I left Wimberley Allison Tongu in Newport Beach to go out on my own doing this sort of support work. And Cyril Rowley at CDB Systems asked me to subcontract with him for his first really major client, HOK. So my first assignment was here at the New York office of HOK doing training for a small group of people. And I've since gone on to do work for the San Francisco, Miami, Dallas, and DC office next month. So been bouncing around doing that quite a bit. So my life right now is literally airport to airport, city to city. And so if I start to fade out, you can hear it going all day long. Hopefully my voice will hold up. So how many of you build content? Those of you using Revit all day long. You're building super sophisticated parametric stuff, or you're just building the stuff that gets you by? Yes and no?
Just to get by to start with.
Yeah. Okay, a little of both. Okay. Been finding it easy? No? A little mysterious? That kind of stuff? Okay. Well, for those of you, now, you guys haven't built any content in Revit at all? Obviously, you haven't used Revit at all, right? Have you at least opened it? You in the back, you said that you've never
I
used
don't
it.
even know what content is.
You don't even know what content is. You know what a block and AutoCAD is?
No.
Do you not use
Let me
AutoCAD?
explain. I'm the spec writer.
Oh,
I write
okay.
specifications. So my interest in this program is how it's going to interface with spec writing.
Oh, okay. All right, so I'll be sure to address the content, the I and him, or whatever.
All these.
We have it in a box, and we've never,
Okay,
and we get the new releases.
well, install it. Install it, play around a little bit. Don't be afraid.
So, behind the column, estimate spec. On a side note, we're going to have a presentation on Revit and e-specs soon. Just waiting. for
Good.
the spec.
Well, this is just my introduction.
Okay, good. Just keep your eye out for that.
Now, I'm going to assume that it's okay if I sit down. So I'll just be more comfortable that way. So I'm going to get rid of this. So the Revit Family Editor, bit mysterious device built inside Revit. There isn't a separate interface. When we call it the Family Editor, it's really the same thing, same application. It's just when you start building content, it ends up showing you a slightly different face. Very slightly different. Just a few different tools. Fewer tools are offered to you. So what I've done over time now is I've been breaking down things. Things into different ideas of information, okay? So I've got this thing broken down into different portions of stuff. So I have the basics, testing and flexing objects when things go wrong, because eventually they do, or very often they do when you're making stuff. So different kinds of things that go wrong that we can talk about. Harder stuff, like nesting objects, rotating or angling stuff, arrays, importing geometry. There's no way we can cover all this in, what do I have, 4 hours?
Yeah.
You guys can stay late, that's permission. And then finally taking charge, using templates, creating your own versions of templates, some other kinds of things that you can make it a little quicker. The next time you have to build a door family, you can just start out, get going. So one of the things I like to do, now some of you have built content, some of you haven't. I don't want to be too mysterious here. So what are families? We asked that question. Doesn't even know what content is. Families in general are the building blocks of your project. So doors, windows, walls, all that kind of stuff. The kind of content that I'm talking about is the content that you build apart from the project itself. So not walls, not floors, not roofs. I'm talking about doors, windows, furniture, parametric objects. How many of you are actually using 9.1 right now? How many are stuck in 9 or 8.1? Wait a minute. Oh, you're in 9. All right, so let's take a quick look at a piece of content. I'm going to open up an existing stock piece of content, ships with Revit. I'm using the Imperial Library because I'm American. I only learned metric a year and a half ago. So let's start off with a door. I'll grab a single flush door. It's the simplest and plainest of all doors in Revit. So we have an object in here that represents a panel. We have an object that represents trim. Another piece of trim. We have a plan representation of the object, which involves an arc and a series of lines that represent this panel in plan. So notice while we have the line work in plan here, we have a plan representation of this panel, this 3D object. Well, it just so happens that this 3D object doesn't appear in the project environment at all, because we have additional control that says, well, I don't want to see that. So there's a great deal of depth, despite the fact that this looks like a rather simple interface. So that's a door. take a look at a window. So again, we've got different elements here. How many people model in 3D solids and so forth in AutoCAD? Doing design and so forth? Okay. Not many of you. So these are solids. So if you're familiar with AutoCAD solids, it's very similar. It's an extrusion of a shape. So again, in plan view, we have all these confusing dimensions and parameters, width 3.0, all that kind of stuff. On the elevation, you can see the solid object here and all these reference planes and so forth. Anybody seriously confused yet? Everybody? Except for like 4 people? Okay. So what does this stuff look like when it's in the project environment? Well, those of you who are using Revit regularly now already know, but those of you who aren't. When you place a door in the wall or a window in the wall, you get the plan representation. You get the south elevation representation, and you get the 3D view of the object. So what does it take to go ahead and build one of these from scratch necessarily? So what would, those of you who are building content regularly, what's the top question on your mind tonight? What's the thing that's bugging you the most right now? Anybody can speak up.
Maybe it's not important enough. I just thought off the top of my head is how to flip, you know, the control zone. Is it now? I just started using it. So,
Okay.
you know, how do you know how to flip something? What plane is it flip? What does it use as an axis to flip the object?
Okay. So what he's asking about is this notion of being able to flip an object. Now, in this case, it's using the door, the host itself, to flip that. And when I flip this, it's using the origin or the center line of the object. So if we take a look at this family up close, like we were a moment ago, these are what Revit calls a control. So there's a control working over here. So that control, when you're using it, you have, these are essentially a rotation function, where when you click it, instead of mirroring the object, it rotates it around. And probably, I think the only place I've ever found a use for that is where I have a handed piece of furniture that doesn't come with a left-handed, it's only right-handed, so a desk and a typing return. If you mirror it over, you're making something the company doesn't make. So if you need it to flip, you need it really to rotate around instead of mirroring. So, that just mystify anybody? Does everybody here use AutoCAD at least? Yeah. All right, so if I say mirror, I'm not talking to a blank stare. It happens. I mean, I've got 3 people in class right now that never use AutoCAD. So when I try to throw out a metaphor, you know, well, it's like this in AutoCAD, they just, yeah. So that's the control object that you're asking about. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Well, actually, I thought that if you hit if you flip it, if you hit the control on the upper left, right there, on the upper left, it flips the door down, right?
That one flips from one side of the wall back to the other side.
Right.
And this one flips it, the hand of the door, right?
So it flips it about the reference plane.
This one flips it based on the host. Okay? This one's going to flip it based on this one, this reference plane in the center, because this reference plane is defining an origin.
So the other reference plane has no regard to the horizontal, other flip, and no regard to the horizontal reference.
If the door is hosted by a wall, then the flip is going to flip it based on that. If there's no host involved, then it'll flip it based on the origin. Now, if the door has an inset, it's still going to flip it over based on the center line of that wall, but based on whatever inset you might have dialed into the door itself. Other question?
I was just saying that was a good question.
Oh, okay. Any other questions like that? And I can just knock off right out of the way? Yeah.
The green lines represent constraints, center lines.
These
That
here?
in particular, that obviously center line, but the other ones are constraints that the door is held to, the size in this case.
What he's referring to here inside the family editor is something called a reference plane. And this reference plane is merely a construction line. The thing that's setting this apart from everything else is that it's constrained with a dimension and what Revit uses the term parameter or label. So if we look up at label here, it says width. So this dimension has had a parameter associated with it defined as width. So if I change the width of this door via family types, and I say that this thing is going to use a different width. Now in this case I've got some types, so I can just choose a different width. When I apply it, we'll find that it shrinks here accordingly. And the beauty of using construction lines is that this solid object can be aligned and locked to that reference plane. So just a couple of construction lines per se can lay out the rules for this door. And then a solid can attach to it, a line can attach to it. All this other related stuff can associate with a single object and a single parameter. So all these different sort of related things change at one time while I've only had to sketch one reference object.
I'm trying to get the parameters to act in concert. For example, I'm trying to put on window grills, or door grills, and glass door, French door, and...
You're trying to do arrays? You're trying to array mullions?
Yeah, basically. And so when I designed this door, this family of doors, that regardless of the size, the grills will move incrementally so that they're all uniform in size. I can't seem to understand how I can make the parameter, or words, constraints maybe, with parameters to work in concert.
All right, well, I'll talk about that in a second, that kind of stuff. Any other questions like that? I can just pick off. Yeah.
I also have the same problem that he's having, but also keeping the parameters straight in the schedules. We, instead of we'll count these doors or new, we're trying to make light fixtures, for example, just two-dimensional symbols for them. Because the Revit library only gives three-dimensional lights, which we don't really need in our office right now, just going through symbols. So we're trying to make various, for example, light symbols for light fixtures that make them, keep them being counted in the various schedules, and we're not able to set that up.
Okay. So you're talking about trying to manage information,
Maybe I manage the,
and you're trying to decide whether to put the information in the family or just in the project itself. Or did you know that there's a
we
difference?
want to bring them into the project.
Right.
Because after we do it, load it into the project, but then the project will be able to count the new, the new symbols or whatever that we're making in the existing schedules.
Okay. All right. So arrays, parameters, schedules. And you had a question?
Yeah, I'd like to know how you approach consistency of making components in terms of front placement, side, left, right. Because a lot of things I've noticed is that between different types of families, it's not clear each placement side is on the top, other times front is on the bottom. Also, I don't know if it's fixing one, but like the doors tend to flip around. But if you create a new door and you create the swing on the opposite side, and you replace it with the door and the swing on the other side, everything flips around. Just curious what methods you approach to make that consistency with different types.
Okay. All right. Any others?
I got visibility, this one in terms of adding text to families. I want certain text to show on the plan, and sometimes it does show up and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes it's light gray and not black.
Okay. So you're saying you want a symbol of an object, but you'd also like to have a related label associated with it? Or would it be better to use a tag?
Object, and then we have in the plan that symbol, but sometimes the symbol reads and sometimes it doesn't.
Okay. All right, so labels. Okay, anything else? I can keep going. We're going to 10, so we've got lots of time.
I'd like to add another. I'd also like to see how you approach reading constraints. Meaning
Sorry?
reading constraints. So objects are constrained.
What are
several
the
things.
constraints are?
How do you actually determine what those constraints are, besides just seeing that there's a lot?
All right. All right, so I'm gonna bail out of this stuff for a second. So when you're building content in Revit, instead of going to File, New Project, you're going to go to File, New Family. So the first set of decisions you have to make is, oh my God, what category am I going to use? So in Revit, there's no layers. Actually, that's a lie. Don't let anyone tell you there's no layers in Revit. The layers are in the walls. Okay, so if you have a wall family, it says right in the dialog box, layers. Okay, so technical, but not layers as you're used to thinking of them. So instead of layers, we have objects that are assigned a preset list of categories. So as you see in this list, we have baluster, baluster panel, baluster post. They're all balusters. And then we have casework, electrical fixtures, doors, furniture, and so on and so forth. Since we can't add a new top-end category into Revit, we have to live with this predefined set. If you find yourself in a situation where you have a family object you want to make that defies the categorization that Revit uses, then you're going to either end up in one of these generic model templates, or you'll end up in probably specialty equipment. Okay, because specialty equipment is basically a CSI catch-all, right? So everything fits in special equipment. And I spent 11 years of my life doing theater rigging and design, and all our stuff was in Division 11. So if I am interested in building a object that's a door, then I'm going to go to my door template. I'm going to start there. If I'm building a window, I'm going to start there. If I just start off this session here, generic, I'll start off with a generic model. So notice the ones that say based, ceiling-based, face-based, floor-based, line-based, roof-based. That means that they're hosted by one of those forms of objects. So if I build one that's wall-based, I can't place that thing in a project until it's got a wall. Okay? So if I'm building a ceiling fan, and I make it ceiling hosted, that's a brilliant decision, right? I'll just hook it on that ceiling. But I've also seen ceiling fans that are attached to the bottom of beams and suspended. So making it predicated on the existence of a ceiling makes it somewhat awkward. So I've seen some situations where I've got to get this ceiling fan in, so they'll draw a little square ceiling, the same diameter and the same size as and then they'll carefully place a ceiling fan on the underside of that ceiling to take up working with space. Or if you build the object as a non-hosted object, then you have the ability later to use a relatively advanced concept of nesting. So I can take a ceiling fan that isn't hosted, nest it in a hosted type, and then apply it to the host as needed. And it's still based on the same object. So I'm going to start off with a generic model so we can talk about some of the questions that were asked here. Now if I say something or point to something you can't see it, just speak up. So the first question I heard, well not first, but one of the things I heard, orientation of things. In this particular template file, there's no indication whatsoever in this plan, floor plan reference letter as it's called, that there's front, back, left, and right. Nothing here to tell me that that's the case. It just so happens that the front in all Revit templates is the bottom of the screen. Now, how many people thought the front was the bottom? Honestly. A couple people? What about you guys? Commit. All right. Commit to an answer. You think that's the front? All right. For some reason, I'm opposite of everybody. I always thought the top was front. That's just, I thought the top would be front. Well, I was wrong. It's really down here. How do I know that? Well, I've done this a bunch, so I'll just sketch something real quick. I'll put a block here, and I'll put another block behind it so I can't see it. And then I'll go to the front elevation. Oh, see, that's the back. Actually, down here, it's using wireframe, so I can see everything. So if I use hidden line, look at that. So the big one's hiding the little one. So this must be front. So front must be down here, right? Make sense? So every template is like that. However, if you start off a door family, new door, and you look at this template, look at this, a little more information. Exterior. Now how many of you think of exterior as the front? When you're thinking in terms of designing a door, right? To be honest, I do. I always thought this was the front because this always said exterior in the door families. And one of the first families you'll build besides a title block in Revit is probably your own door. So I thought this was the front for the ages. And then exterior happens to be named that way, so that's convenient. But this is really front. So if you look at this reference plane, it says right, okay? And this one says left. And this one says center, left, right. So I go to what I think is front, exterior, and I click on this one, which should be right. Oh, wait a minute, that's left. So I go to interior, and I pick on the right one. Oh, that's right. So if by process of elimination, this must be front, okay, based on the orientation of these guys. Now that everyone's got that straight, perfect, burned and drained?
Steve?
Yes.
I found that in some families where it says placement side and back, it tends to be reversed. And I'm speaking on Revit 9, I haven't checked it out in 9.1, so they could change that.
You might be referring to, profiles, because that placement side is in there for that.
Oh, a wall-based.
A wall-based casework might say that, yeah. The other kind of strange thing is if you go to a 3D view, Revit always seems to be looking at the back of the wall. So I've seen instances where people model a bunch of stuff on the front of the wall and go to 3D view and it's not there. Oh my God, there's my stuff. Then they spin the view around. Oh, there it is, thank God. So anyway, in the generic model, at the very basic, the lowest of all lowest levels, we have this reference plane here, which is called center left right. Now the fundamental practice in Revit is to lay out construction lines, add dimensions, position them where the extents of your geometry are, add dimensions and add parameters to those dimensions so that you can get the construction lines flexing the way you want, and then you add the solids or voids that you need to create the form that you're looking for, or you draw a symbolic line over the subject. So this reference plane happens to be called center left right, and this one happens to be called center front back. If I look at the properties of this reference plane, notice the name parameter says center left right, and there's this other guy down here called is reference. For those of you familiar with Revit, if you've been placing objects in the project and then dimensioning them or using alignment features, these strong references, these are named, so these are therefore strong references by default. You have a weak reference and something called not a reference, and then a strong reference when you lack a name that fits what you want to call it. This function of referencing leads towards the question that was talking about alignment issues. If this is center left right, and this is right, and there's left over here, and then I build one exactly the opposite, if I exchange these two objects, Revit will flip them over, because the reference lines that are in there say, well, I know where right is. Right's over here now. Flip. Now you got a door that's opposite of the door you thought it was, just by virtue of exchanging this door type for that door type. So in terms of consistency, it's very important that you understand the orientation. And if you open all of Revit's stock doors, you'll find that the door panel is drawn on the right-hand side. Every single one. So fortunately, it's been pretty consistent. I haven't run across one built opposite yet. Although I've built one opposite before. So I wondered what was going on. So the function here is we're going to use a reference plane to define the center of our object. And that leads to another thing of consistency. If I want doors to swap out and change so that they flex from the center out equally, then I have to build that kind of decision in. And if I want them to grow from the right to the left at all times, then I have to design that in as well. So I have to be careful how I constrain things with dimensions and or locking and so forth. So this reference plane is named. The naming function is important too, because if I've named it, then I can build objects using that reference plane, because this reference plane actually defines a work plane, or can define a work plane. To prove that, I'm going to go to a front elevation, and I'm going to draw a reference plane at a weird angle. And then I'm going to go to 3D, and I'm going to try to change my work plane to that reference plane. Look at that, it doesn't see it at all. Okay, so that didn't work. Go back to front, and then I pick this and go to properties instead. Keep looking up there, Mr. Ryan. Angled plane. Now that it has a nice pretty name, go back to 3D. Change my work plane, turn on my work grid. So my work grid currently is the reference level, or that default level in the family template here. If I go in now, because I named it, notice angled plane is my option. And watch what happens to this grid. The grid has changed its orientation according to the angle of that particular reference plane. So the reference planes define work planes, or potentially they can. So if I build an object on that work plane now, create solid extrusion, I just don't remember. So there's the object on that work plane. Go to front. Must be behind it. Miles away from reality. It's down there. Where are you? There you are. Way off in space. On that work plane, however, right? So it's restrained to that. So if this reference plane were to change, so too should the object that's based on it ultimately. So now it's changed its angle relative to reality as well. So work planes are very, very important. They define, the reference planes define potential work planes for us. So if I name this one, I can build geometry on it. If I name the one in plan, center, front, back, then I can build geometry on it. So if I'm building glass from the front elevation, and I want to sketch a plate of glass, and I want it to be on center, front, back, and I want it to be equally spaced on either side of that reference plane, I just create a sketch, tell it to be one dimension or the other relative to it. Set my work plane, center, front, back is what I've got. So I've got a big chunky piece of glass here, right, theoretically. So this is the work plane that it's built on, right? If this work plane moves, so does the object. So if I set up a parameter to move this reference plane back and forth, then the object will move with it accordingly, so I can get control out of the object pretty easily. Yes?
These work planes also come in to help you define where things are dimensions go there.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's set up a little box here. I'm going to copy this reference plane 2 feet to the left, mirror it to the right, copy this one 2 feet, mirror it down below. Now, I didn't name this one, I didn't name this, I haven't named this, I haven't named that, I haven't named any of those. Just got these guys so far, right? If I add, I'm just going to add a model line, which is, anybody know what the difference between model lines are? No? In the project environment, you have model lines and you have detail lines. In the family editor environment, you have a model line and a symbolic line. So model lines are viewed or visible in all views. So I go to 3D, there's my line, right? If I draw the same line using symbolic lines, I go to 3D, no line. So symbolic line works intended for view-specific applications, plan only, elevation only, side view only. Only the views that are parallel to the symbolic line that I draw is where it will be seen. So if I draw, just for the sake of argument, I'm just going to draw a model line off to the left here and above. Excuse me. There's some little secret glue or magic going on inside Revit that doesn't pop out and it doesn't expose itself to most people until you get into this quite a while. And it's one of the things I like to show really early on. When you draw objects and then you place them in the project, Revit just seems to know how to keep them in the same spot. They don't wander around or do anything strange. And that's because there's something called automatic sketch dimensions. And it's off by default. And I turn them on, no change, nothing exciting yet. However, as soon as I start adding dimensions and constraints to my project, or my family rather, and I click EQ, watch what happens. You see these other dimensions suddenly appear? As soon as I got specific and said I want these reference planes to always stay equally spaced, so if I move this one apart, they should maintain that equal spacing, right? As soon as I did that, Revit added this dimension, it added this dimension, and it added this one. And it needed to in order to keep this endpoint exactly there, this endpoint exactly there, and to keep this a certain distance from that reference plane there. So unless I add more dimensions to this family, Revit's going to maintain those for me. I can't even delete them. So I pick them and delete them, trying to get rid of them. They're there. The reason most people don't see them is because in every view in the template, they're off. So you put this in a project, you change the equal spacing of such or other, you change its width. In the project, that line always stays put. I don't know how it manages to know how to do that. It's the automatic sketch dimension. So to take that to the next step here, I'll delete this. I'm going to add a solid form. I'm going to park it on these reference planes. Notice these lock symbols. When you build solid objects and you have the construction lines in place, I can lock in a relationship so that if those construction lines move, so too will the solid object. Now, if I turn around and say I'd like to have it in a set of lines inside this that are 4 inches away, and I offset it 4 inches using copy here, if I click and tab, select all 4 lines in one go, and Revit pops out these automatic sketch dimensions for me. So it's going to manage the spacing or the position of that inside set of lines for me automatically. I don't even have to worry about it anymore. If I only want those to be 4 inches away from the other line all the time, that's what it'll do. Even if this changes, and even if that changes, or if this changes. So no matter what I do to this thing to flex it, Revit's going to keep that condition in place for me. So unless I know to look for automatic sketch dimensions, I have no idea that they're there, right? Because they're off. Very, very important, because most reasons families fail is because they don't realize automatic sketch dimensions aren't there.
How'd you pull up that box to click it?
Visibility graphics. I used a keyboard shortcut because
Yeah.
I'm sneaky. So I used View, Visibility graphics. And in Revit, the keyboard shortcuts that are predefined for you from the factory, they show up in this list on the side. So if you're looking for a command, you go into the list, you go, oh, PT is paint. TR is trim extend. So if you get used to using the menus at first, and then you slowly get used to this, you can dial it in. Fortunately, most of the commands at least start with the first letter, and then it's sometimes the next letter. In this case, VG is, and they also have the ability to program related or double keystrokes, so VV happens to launch the same command, but you have to dig into the keyboard shortcut file to know that. So VG launches this dialog box, and this gives me access to each of the types, the model categories, annotation categories, and imported categories if I link DWG file.
Is that similar to when you say show dimensions on the options bar? You know, select
Activate dimension?
activate.
No, that's different. He's referring to a feature inside the project environment. When you draw a lot of walls and have a lot of objects, and you pick an object, Revit offers temporary dimensions. So when I pick this object, see these temporary dimensions here? Revit as a piece of software, it gets to a point where there's so many possible choices to generate the temporary dimensions that Revit says, I'm not going to do that anymore. If you really want them, then you tell me. And they click the button and then it turns them off. So it's deciding that you take a performance hit if you force it to do
It's
that.
different than showing the Revit control dimensions.
Yeah. Now, regarding constraints, if I lock a constraint, you have an option to choose show related, so this answers your question about showing what is constrained. If you use show related, it gives you this dialog. It tells you, it can cycle through and highlight the different objects to see which. So in the first instance, I've got the reference plane here, so it's referencing that. And then I click the other one, and it's showing the other reference plane. So it's highlighting the two objects that are bound by that constraint. I'd show the show related for the equality statement, and I cycle through those, and it's showing the 3 objects that are affected by that constraint. All right, so if I want to add a dimension across here that says width, I can add another dimension. Yeah.
How does it is there a hierarchy to the reference plane in terms of why is it when you pull one, it moves actually the center one instead in order to maintain it equal rather than moving the 2 random ones?
I don't know the exact logic programmatically why it does that, but what I found is that if I add a parameter to this dimension, call it width, spell it right. As soon as I do that, when I flex width, it flexes it equally. Okay, so the issue there is when you're flexing it by dragging, then it's pulling it. No, hey, Chris, you still here? In some cases, when you have an equality constraint, you'll see that there's an anchor here. Now, the anchor can be relocated. And when you have the anchor in place,
Where do you get the anchor to?
I picked the reference plane.
Okay.
Okay, so that anchor showed up, so now I can move the anchor to another spot. When I do that, that usually forces it to behave as you're describing. Okay?
Does the anchor relate to the defined origin property of the floor plan?
It's literally to the objects involved in the constraint. So in this case, we've got 3 objects. So I'm forcing the anchor to stay here, so it's flexing this way, as opposed to if I move the anchor back to this side, then it grows this way. Okay. And this anchor really only appears when we're dealing with the equality.
You can change your family tax to stay there as well, to move to the anchor to that.
Well, it was here already, so when I use the dimension across here, I'm flying through this, but I should really have stopped there. If I change this value now, so even if the anchor, so it's,
Once you get the overall.
yeah, again, that's why I say I don't really know the programmatic reason for it, but I know how it behaves. So, and once I've got a width parameter on there, it goes.
Do you ever use any pinning or something references?
I've used pinning on the reference planes in the center occasionally, and I'll pin one on the left or something if I want it to try to grow that way. So if I pin, I can't reach it there, so edit pin, and then try to flex it. So the pinning will force it.
I'm sorry, what's the difference between the pinning and the anchor? I missed that.
The anchor is related to this constraint
Yeah.
and the reference planes. Now I need to unpin this probably to get it play again. So there's the anchor, right? The anchor didn't appear because I imposed another constraint on it where it said, I can't really show you the anchor now because you've gone and pinned this on me, right? So if I unpin it, now where it says, all right, fine, I can do the anchor again.
Do they act similarly, the pin and the anchor?
I guess you could say sort of. I mean, if you say you pin this thing instead. I mean, again, it's one of those things where this is sort of the black magic part of Revit where you put this dimension on and suddenly it flexes the way I want it to until I pin this reference point. Okay. Now, if I don't put this dimension on it and I pin the reference plane and I stretch it, it stretches the way I expect it, right? But if I change this and move the anchor around, then it behaves the way I'm hoping it will based on that constraint. So we've got a couple of different, I can go the pin route, I can go the anchor route. It really comes down to what you want. The point is to make a decision, which is, fortunately, I'd say probably 90% of all content that I've ever built has been built center out. Now, if I go back and select my solid here, and I edit this, notice those temporary sketch dimensions are still there, right? The automatic sketch dimensions, not temporary, automatic. So Revit's still managing the thickness of this guy here. So if I go in and I grab these, and to add a parameter, oh, that line is too sorry. So I've got all 4 dimensions selected. To associate a parameter with a dimension, the easiest route is to select a dimension in general. But these are automatic sketch dimensions, so I have no option. I actually have to turn them into real dimensions. And there's no way to make an automatic sketch dimension turn into a real one. So my only option at this point is to start sketching my own. So I'll go back. If I sketch my own from the reference plane to this line here, for example, notice that one went away. So I'll do it again. I go to this reference plane, to this line, and now watch this one disappear. So now I've got my own. So as I describe my own constraints, Revit gives up, gets rid of the others. So I've got my own now. As soon as I have my own, now I'm going to have the ability to assign a parameter to them. So under Label, Add a Parameter, you can just click on the Add Parameter option, and type in framed with whatever the name should be. Then you get into this whole debate about grouping. What should I group it under? Should it be under dimensions? Should it be under others? Should it be under identity data? Again, it's just a matter of organizing the information so it falls in the same location and it's repeatable or understandable. So when I finish constraining that, and I go to the family types dialog, I've got a frame with dimension that's right there next to my other dimensions. So some folks will take things that are constraints or sort of something just to govern behavior, but they don't want users interacting with it a lot. They'll move it into other, because other ends up down at the bottom of our list. So if I add another one here, see this one here? It ends up down here at the bottom. So since people never scroll, they'll never find other, right? Okay. Hide it from the user. Now, if I change frame width to 0.6, because I've added that constraint, I can click apply, and notice the frame is adjusted for me.
Steve, is there any difference applying dimensions within the sketch versus outside of the sketch?
No, the result's the same, but there's a couple schools of thought. If you're going to do constraints inside a sketch like this, it's nice because it obscures, it makes what you have to look at here cleaner, a little easier to deal with. But at the same time, it sort of hides that complexity from people. So if they go in and they start changing things, they don't necessarily realize that you have some constraints lurking in there. So you can have a very complex family when you only see a couple parameters. But why is there 15 other parameters? What do they do? So you have to start digging to find your way in. The fundamental thing I do is if I put constraints like this in, I do them all in the sketch for this thing. I don't mix and match. I don't do half of them in here and then finish my sketch and then put the other half outside. Okay? So just be consistent. And you can also over-constrain things by trying to do that. So if I go in and say, put this on here, say it let me do it. But if I try to give it a different constraint, Revit's saying dimension over constrains the family because, well, I didn't realize that there's one lurking inside the sketch of that object. Is everybody comfortable with this notion of sketching objects in general? That takes some getting used to as well. Okay, you build a lot of objects in Revit in sketch mode. You build stairs, railings, floors, roofs, ceilings, like down, in-place families. Sketch mode, big with Revit. You build something simple, Revit builds the thing that's hard. Okay. So whenever you're building stuff, building a solid object, you've only got 4 kinds of solids you can make. An extrusion, a blend, a revolve, and a sweep. But they all are based on a sketch. Does everybody know the difference between an extrusion and a blend?
Yeah.
Well, for those who don't, an extrusion is a single profile that has a certain depth. Whatever the shape is, however deep you tell it to be. A blend is exactly the same except it uses 2 profiles. And it creates a shape based on this sketch and a shape based on this sketch. Whatever they may be and however deep they are. It works out the geometry between the 2. A revolve is, again, a sketch of a profile spun around an axis. Think of wine glass. And then the last is a sweep, which is yet another sketch of a profile that follows a path somewhere. Now, how many people use Viz or Max? A couple of you? Familiar with the loft tool? We still don't have a loft in Revit. People, AutoCAD 2007 gets a loft, but we don't get a loft. So clearly there's some inequity there. I guess they waited 20 years for a loft, so we have to wait a couple more.
Steve, I have one
Yes.
question on the constraints. You're talking about putting the labels inside the sketch versus outside the sketch. Let's say I wanted to change the actual thickness of that frame.
This way. Yeah, you can't do it in a
Could
sketch.
I do that? I couldn't do it inside the sketch.
Well,
I have to do it outside.
You have to constrain its depth. So if I go to right, this view here, I can't really constrain this inside the sketch, can I? I can, however, constrain it in here. So extrusion end and extrusion start. Every one of these extrusions has these parameters. And there's this little gray, if it's a snake it'd bit you kind of button looking here. If I click on that, I can associate it with a parameter, call it depth. And then, notice it has an equal sign now. and it's not giving me a chance to punch something in here. So now I can go back, family types. Where did I put it? Under other? Yeah, see, there it is. So I couldn't find it. So 2, apply, and see how it increased slightly? Apply. Now, one of the tricks that you can make, if you don't want people to mess with this in the project environment, is to put your value right in here in the formula. Make it 5 feet, so then I load it into the project. Switch back to family, use my handy dandy load into project button. And I place my cool generic component. And I go to 3D. There's my cool box. I go into properties, type parameters, and I can't change depth. Okay? So I've created this little hurdle that somebody has to get over in order to be able to modify that thing. So if depth is something I don't really want to change, just put it in the formula side of the equation there, and now it's not available for me. Whereas frame width is something I can readily change if I need to. Right here in the project side.
When you change that, right? I'm reading you, I don't know if you want to go.
No, I can't. It's blocked out. See, I can't touch it. Even if I make 10 different types, I can't touch it. The only way to get back and touch that thing is to edit the family itself. And then go back into family types and say, you know what? I made a mistake. It really sick. And then load it back into my project.
Leaving it blank will make it editable inside the project.
Yeah, if I put it in the formula side, then it's hard coded essentially. If I put it in the regular side, over here under value. Now, one thing I can do, if I delete this value, Revit will just stick that value into the other one. So a tip and trick, if I've got 5 types in this thing, and I want to get the same value into 5 types really quick, put it in the formula side first. Just apply the value, and it'll apply that value to each of the types, and then delete it, and it'll stick it in the other side. What am I talking about? I'm talking gibberish here, right? So family types, I'll create a couple new types. So now this family has 3 sizes potentially. Type 1 has a 6-foot width and a 4-inch frame and a 6-inch or 6-foot depth, right? If I want them all to be 6 foot, I add it to this side, click apply, and then if I check this, they're all 6 foot. So I go to each of these types. Now, if I go back to type 1 and delete this, they've all got a 6-foot value, but now I can make 3, 4, and 2 can be 8 or 9. Then when I load it in the project, I've got 3 types now. So I've got 1, 2, 3. So I change this to a 1, copy this over here, copy this over here, change this one to 3, change this to 2. So one family, multiple configurations, all based on the types. Now Revit has a kind of object that uses something called a type catalog, which takes that functionality out to another whole level of use. Structural I-beams are a good example of that. Steel. If I click on W flange, if I don't double click on it, I just click it to select it and wait patiently, it populates this list down here of all of the sizes that happen to come out of essentially the AISC manual. So if I wanted a 6 by 12, and a W8 by 24, and a 16 by 31, et cetera, I just select them from the list. So I don't have to manage. Imagine managing in this family, in this dialog, managing that list. It'd get pretty long. And I guarantee you'd forget to change one of the parameters in this dialog box. So the type catalog makes it easy because all it is a TXT file with columns of data separated by commas.
Steve,
Yeah.
can the steel table be trusted?
Absolutely, implicitly.
Is there a disclaimer buried somewhere that if you use this and it's not right?
Well, it did come with the software, so it has to be trusted. Right? and I read it on the internet. So I'm going to go to the content. I'm going to go to the content. Let's see. Where is that stuff? I always forget. Documents and settings. It's nested a little deep. Application data, Autodesk, Revit Building 9, Imperial Library, structural, framing, steel. Okay, see this little TXT file working next door? The trick to making these guys work, make sure it has the exact same name as the family that it supports, but it's .txt instead of .rfa. So if I open the TXT file, that's what it looks like. So unless Steve Campbell entered the wrong number in here, possible, I suppose, right? This is absolutely to be trusted. Slight cynicism or skepticism, perhaps, but the goal is that it would be trustworthy.
The format of that is just throwing values into each parameter element.
Yeah, there's in the help documentation under text or type catalogs, there is an explanation of how you use it. And the structure is pretty simple. You have the parameter name, which is W in this case, the kind of parameter data type it is, and then any other information. So like there's nothing else loaded here. So A for area and inches, and D for length and inches. So you set up each of the parameters across the top, and then you supply the data for each of those values. And then it populates that list. And if there's an error, Revit tells you. You try to open that, it tells you there's an error. So start slow. 1 row, 2 rows of data. And then once you're comfortable, expand on that. Yes?
When you get your 3 types now, can you get Revit to export the TXT file, or do you have to make it yourself?
Yeah, I have to make it. Yeah, no, there's no quick and easy export your types, unless there's one in SLM's version.
There is a little free app that,
Oh, Guy. Yeah, Guy made it.
we'll put a link to it on our DVD or something. It's basically a little Python script that takes an Excel file and
Yeah.
create a Revit-based
TXT.
TXT file for your family. So
Yeah.
we used to do that with Windows types and things like that.
Are you all familiar with Augie? I mean, James mentioned it earlier, but are members of Augie? Yes? If you do a search there for Guy Robinson, who's in Kiwi or is he Australia? He's in, yeah. So he's done we're working on a bunch of programming items for Revit, things he was exploring with. And one of the things he wrote was a Python script to automate the process of, you can store all that data in an Excel row and column setup. And then you can run Zap to write it to a TXT file. So if you end up doing a bunch of this, it's worthwhile, taking a few minutes to get familiar with that.
Does this accept anything like C# or VB or Autodesk or CAD?
Revit's API can, I know that some people are writing stuff for the API in C# and C++ is the native language for Revit. The API is not, well, I mean, in terms of content creation, it's starting to get more robust where you can build objects using the API. But I gave up programming in VB in 2000. So.
There are a number of API classes planned for AU.
Yeah, Danny's doing one. Somebody else doing another one?
I think there's about 4 or 5.
Yeah. Are you going to AU?
No.
Not yet, right? Okay. All right, how much time we got? Just an hour already?
Mark yourself another 15 minutes.
Okay.
And make sure we have some time for questions.
All right. Let me,
Can I ask you?
yeah.
Is there a way when you make a dimension, that you can down to level, on one hand you can make them equal, you make it equal plus, you make formulas on the dimension.
Well, in the family environment, you can set up formulas where, let's say my width value, if I want to say that my depth should be the width times 2, or the width divided by 3, or something, it's just a matter of using the parameter, right? So width, it's case sensitive, so you got to make sure it's typed exactly the same as the other. So one of the things in my little mind manager thing is, things not to do with your parameter names, don't use minus and plus. Okay, because if you use minus and plus in your parameter name, then you try to use that in a math equation, Revit's going to try to do math on itself. It's going to say it can't do it. basically not going to be able to solve the formula until you realize, oh, I'm using width dash something. So it's trying to do math on its own name. So if I say width divided by 3, it's coming up with 2 foot, right? So if I switch to the other type, the width hasn't changed, right? So I'll make this something else. So now I've got 1. Another example would be, let's say you're trying to find out the pitch or the slope of something. So if I create a parameter called rise, create another parameter called run, and I create another one called slope, make it an angle. Then I can enter a value for run, or foot, and a value for rise. And then for this, I can type atan rise divided by run. And it calculates the angle. So then I can use that value to keep objects a certain distance apart from each other. Uh-oh. What did I do wrong?
He's not gonna give up on
I'll bail. We don't have 15 minutes. Sometimes my memory's not so good. All right. Consistency. We can talk about naming a little bit of parameters and stuff. Visibility. The issue of visibility. Solid objects in Revit, the model line work in Revit, they can all have a visibility setting. If you select the solid, there's a visibility button on the options bar. I can tell Revit I don't want to see this thing in plan. If I do that, and then load it in, watch what happens when I go to the plan. Oh, nothing's there. Uh-oh. In fact, when you try to place an object that has no representation in plan, normally Revit will give you an error message and say, hey, I can't see anything when you place them. They're really there, but there's just nothing visible. So a good example of that would be, let's say you have this sort of base and it's really ornate. You've got a whole bunch of steps. And all you'd really like to see is the outside edge of it. It's 4 feet at the base, but it steps back a whole bunch. And if you put it in an 8-scale plan at its normal resolution of showing all those lines, you have this big, gigantic black line, big blob. Well, if you tell Revit not to show this complex thing in plan, and then you just sketch symbolic line work now, so I'm going to hide this using temporary hide isolate, and those sunglasses down here, hide object. Then I go to my symbolic line work, and I go to generic models, projection, and then I sketch these lines on top of this, and lock them in so that they'll move with the line work, and then load this into the project. Now I've got just simple squares, right? And I don't see the extra lines that might be there. So that takes something that's pretty complex and is way too much information in the 8-scale plan. It makes it a little easier to manage, right? Now, if I go back to the family, in addition to being able to control the visibility of these things with regard to their plan or view orientation, you can also specify whether or not it's visible at coarse or medium or fine. So it's kind of in combination or in concert with that. You can say, this thing's too complex for coarse, but if I get into a view where I'm using fine, well, now it's okay. So let me show it there. So I could say, show it in plan, but don't show it in coarse or medium. And then in the line work in plan, I could say, you know what, we'll show it in coarse, but we won't bother to show it in fine. So it doesn't compete with each other, right? So then I load it in the project. So now my view is at 8th scale. So I'll make a call out that's using something larger. 3/4. Go to that view and switch to fine. Now I've got more detail. Okay? Good example of using this sort of thing if you download the UK doors that are on the web. They've got hardware in there, what they call ironmongery. If you use those doors, they've got some of that stuff set up to only show them up in fine. So if you end up doing an enlarged elevation of the door assembly, you change to fine, and suddenly the door closer and the hardware shows up on the door. So, yeah.
We found a method of controlling plan visibility between RCPs and variable plans that don't involve changing the cut plane on different views. For instance, a large case where cabinet has a door entry, you want to dot different stuff going on with a hedge.
So everything's above your cut plane, but you'd still like to see the object represented?
That's right, you said the object's turned off and it's visibility on the symbolic line.
That's the old invisible line trick. If you go back to the family. When you have an object that's well above the cut plane, so most plan views in Revit, the cut plane's 4 feet above the floor. I can't see this when I load it in the project because it's technically above the plane. If I sketch a model line, I make it visible type from the base elevation here up so that it at least goes through the cut plane. And then I can strain those points to the top so that if the thing moves up or down. Revit, if this invisible line is cut, then Revit can show the objects that are related to that. So if I draw some symbolic line work in plan, then that symbolic line work will show up. A good example of that is to take a look at the casework, wall-based casework that Revit has.
We've done that, but not with good success. I mean, sometimes certain objects don't represent. We've done it with some clear story windows, where the window is split up.
Where windows are a different animal because windows actually use, the cut plane in the family also affects how it's represented in the project. So windows are a special animal when it comes to cut plane. And that's why they created the plan region tool. So if you have a window that's above your level, you can use a plan region to have it show up. So you can build the window normally, as if it's right here, move it up in height, and then use a plan region to have it show up properly. So that's essentially outside of the family editor itself, it's just in the project environment. Talked about showing constraints, visibility of objects. The only one that was, haven't touched on a little bit, was this notion of labeling, or labels in objects. I hope it's in here. Washer dryer. Help me, Chris, remember where it is? Thanks. Washer dryer. Now, I don't know if they've taken the concept out of this thing, but I go to plan. Not still there. Text by itself will never show up inside the Revit family. It's just built that way. It's not going to show up. So if I want a piece of text to show up in the Revit family, so if I put it in plan, it's going to show up, I have to use a label. And actually, I have to nest the label. So this object is actually a family, another family. So if I go to File, Load from Library, go to Family, Annotation, I'm looking for a label family of a predefined size. I can create more sizes and stuff. So what they did is they loaded a label annotation object into this family, and then they hooked up a parameter called label. Okay, so when this thing's loaded into the project, all I have to do is change the label value in the object. And there's also visibility control. So if I select it, I go to visibility. Right now, this thing does not show up at coarse. So if you've been having some trouble with it, you might find that if you go to look at the object, or when you created it, if it was set up to show up only in a certain condition like fine or medium, then you'd have to change your plan or the view to show that proper level of detail. So if I go to, say, component, washer, so in this view it's not there, right? So if I put one in here, there's the W. Now, in my view, it's a fairly serious limitation to this concept because that's 3/32 text, and it only really looks right at a certain scale. Well, maybe the 8th scale looks great, but a quarter or half-inch doesn't. It moves around. And one of the things I did was I had a projection screen symbol that mounted on a wall. And I had a PS projection screen, and at 8th scale it was gold. But I switched to an enlarged plan at quarter, and that thing started working its way farther away from the screen every time. So I ended up having to set up a situation where I could set up different rules. I had these parameters for 8th scale, quarter scale, and I would just toggle on the visibility of the thing. So it started to turn into real work. So I said, you know what, that stinks. I'm just going to use a tag. So the Revit tagging functions, annotation tag, if you want to report a certain value, just set the tag up so that it's using that parameter instead of mark or type mark. All right, it's 4 o'clock, 4:11. 4:11, so that means it's really 7:11 here, right? All right, more questions? I can stay here as long as you want to stay, but you don't have to stay just because of me. Yeah. Oh, yeah. All right, so information. He's about to walk away, and I'm going to talk about information. So Revit out of the box, objects have at least this collection of data for identity. Cost, assembly code, description. Whether you fill it out or not is completely up to you. But if you use the assembly code value, Revit's going to go out to a table and try to find a uniform classification for that object. So this was some generic object. So I'm going to say it's something related to services, it's an HVAC device, et cetera, et cetera. I pick that, it's a chilled water system. It fills that value in. Then when I do scheduling later, I can choose to show both the assembly code and the description. And if you're familiar with eSpec, anybody heard of that? A couple people, eSpec? eSpec is built on this premise here, so unless they've changed it lately. In order to take advantage of eSpec, you have to take time to build in this assembly code data and or expand on it so that their product can support your information that you're trying to schedule. Now fundamentally, my particular habit or recommendation is that I don't put any information inside a family unless it's changing geometry. Okay, so unless it's physically altering my object in some fashion, I don't need it in the family. Because the last thing I want to do is I have to manage 1,000 objects to get Steve's cool data into that family. Much more efficient is to simply say in the project environment and in your project templates, I add a project parameter. And I say that all mechanical equipment gets it. Okay? So if I say that mechanical equipment gets it, light fixtures get it, electrical stuff get it, all these different categories get it. If it's a text value, and I group it under something, identity data, whatever, what have you, mechanical maybe, mechanical equipment, then if I add mechanical equipment to the project, and this happens to be specialty equipment, so I don't have that. I'll put a nice furnace in. So now I've got a furnace, and if I look at its parameters, notice my cool parameters there. So each of these objects, as I add it to the project, I didn't take any time to put that parameter in the object itself, I just put it in the project. And the project took care of associating it with the mechanical object that I add. That takes a huge level of overhead off of my back in terms of keeping the data. So now the project is king. Project manages my information. Now, that doesn't work when you're dealing with a parameter that actually has to change something about this. So if I have an output location that needs to move because I've changed the model number, now I'm starting to change a flange off the back of this thing. And I need to move it over physically so that I can coordinate that in the field. That parameter belongs in the family because it's changing something fundamentally about it. So that's my personal belief about the parameters and such. I'm lazy, so I want to avoid making parameters too much. Yeah. In the project environment?
Yeah, right there.
Properties.
Oh, it's okay.
So it's right here.
Oh, no, sorry.
You mean when I added the parameters?
Yeah.
Okay, that's under settings, project parameters. Now I don't have an internet connection. I can plug my blog. I've been posting on a blog at revitoped.com since November 2004 now. The first 2 months is just meaningless nonsense, but I started adding worthwhile stuff after that. So I've been posting stuff about a variety of things for a long time. I've got a post there, like about the reference planes, for example. It's called Is You Is or Is You Ain't. The Is reference parameter made me think of the Is You Is song, Is You Is or Is You Ain't My Baby. And then I've got other ones called What Are Parameters and Why Should I Care? So you can read up on that. It talks about parameters from an overview. And then it talks about whether I should put parameters in the family or not. Making a shared parameter, which is a whole other animal. But I've got a wild number of posts just about parameters in general. So the searching function at Blogger doesn't seem to be working right now. So if you actually search from Google, the Google side, just type in parameters and Revit Op-Ed or Steve Stafford, then you'll typically get a hit of a number of different posts that I made. So if you want to review that kind of stuff, feel free. And I've also got blog links to, there's probably like 15 blogs now about Revit. And so I've got links to all of them that I know about on the side. There's some in French, Portuguese, Spanish, and There's a site in Korean as well, so there's a bunch of it, a lot of activity. What did they sell? 90,000 seats this last year? So it's a fair number. I only got one of those. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, what about an object that you can use like, you have a 3D model, okay, you have annotation, and for the plan view, you have symbol, for instance, like a card reader. You have a box with CR using annotations. Then with the 3D, you would have a 3D model. Would you have 3 different items similar to the washer and dryer?
Potentially, yeah. The examples of those are the electrical fixtures, and I think this guy, 4 single? No, switch. Dimmer. The switch dimmer is an example of that. This is a label, and the symbology here, and then there is a box on the wall. But just a word of caution. The examples that they ship with, there's an intrinsic problem to them. We don't, if I put this on a wall, that dimmer indication on the side, that's tied to the box, okay? So if in the real world, they move the box over here underneath another switch, now I've got a switch and a D on top of each other, okay? So these things need to be built so that the annotation object can be dragged away from where the object is, so that I can model the real condition and see it in elevation, and then move the annotation around where it really belongs, because the annotation is really schematic.
Are those all 3 separate pieces though? And they're just nested?
This piece here, yeah, they're nested. This piece here, if I open it, is this. So I've got line work, and then this label object. And then that is nested inside here in position, excuse me. And then this is a piece of symbolic line work. Actually, it's a blend, sorry. That is, that's the 3D object that I'm seeing. And the host object has been turned off. So it's actually hosted on a wall.
You could at this point move the nomenclature, the Ds, to a more suitable position
Here,
and save it and problem solved.
yeah, the problem is that works once, maybe twice. If you're really lucky, 3 times. And then the 4th and the 5th and the 6th. Now you're back into the family changing its position again.
I'm sorry, could you save it as a family not within the project, but within Revit, and so you're always using the corrected version?
The simpler, although less obvious solution perhaps, is just to set this object up with its own set of parameters. So the box goes on the wall, and then the annotation itself has another set of reference planes and its own set of dimensions. And if I make them instance dimensions, I can actually just take that object and just drag it to a new spot. It takes a little extra effort, but it makes the thing much more flexible. And none of the content's built that way yet, so that's one of the things we need to address. Because let's face it, I mean, the DS, 3-way, stacked on top, and now it starts to be meaningless. So one would argue that maybe it makes sense to put the boxes where they really belong, and then to give us a clever way to tag them in the plan so that we can just do what we need to do. So maybe they need to revisit it. And I haven't seen any real improvement in Revit systems on that front. So it's one of those things that we're getting working on.
Isn't this something that the electrical and mechanical and plumbing versions are going to have to get right?
I would think
those,
so, yeah.
Those drawings are much more symbolic than
Yes.
the architectural drawings.
Right. Yeah, some people, when they're confronted with this, bail, and they just do symbology. They don't even bother to put boxes on the wall. And then now you're back where we were before, right? We don't have a box on the wall, we can't coordinate it. Hey, that's right on top of a column. That's not going to work. And when I was in theater, this proscenium arch, we used to send out shop drawings that says nothing can go on the proscenium arch within 4 feet of this edge. Nothing. And then I'd come on site and I'd see junction box, cable, right? See the arch over the top penetrated with ductwork, all this kind of stuff. And I'm saying, well, guys, when I put the fire curtain in here, the fire curtain's going to overlap the arch 2 feet, and you're not going to be able to reach the switches. You're not going to be able to reach it because we're also going to put the Z plate channel around it. It's going to completely enclose it. It's going to be utterly useless space to you. And they go, oh. And it's a change order to move them all over there, even though my shop drawings clearly said, oh, by the way, don't put anything over here. So
it's the old toilet over the beam problem.
it's just an offset flange, right? Or actually, you got to build a podium for the toilet. Any more questions?
Can you have, and I imagine hosting, basically an object that doesn't have host space, not hosting, onto like an object really, as an object, just an object.
So you want to host something on another object? Okay, they created a new template in here called face-based, generic face-based.
Yeah, I tried that.
Okay, the face-based family can be placed on any face essentially.
Yeah, I tried using that.
So I did a post on my blog that showed the notion of using a face-based object but with a void, and I put it on the edge of the roof, put it on the top of the roof, put it on the side of the wall, and I put it on another object. The face-based one, when it's cutting stuff, it has to be a host object, so it has to be a wall, roof, or floor or something. But if it's just face-based, it should just be able to land on that face. And the other thing you probably missed was specifying that it's work plan based. So when you go to the settings of a family, oh, by the way, I'm in a generic model family right now, right? Everybody remember that from the beginning of class 4 hours ago? Okay. It's a generic model. If I go to the settings menu, family categories and parameters, I can actually tell Revit, oh, you're really a door. Or no, I've changed my mind, you're planting now. Okay, so I can technically fake it out. The upside of using that approach is you start with a generic model, change it to door. Now it's a door that schedules, but the door doesn't host it. So if I have a railing, a gate, for example, I need a gate. I want it to look like a door, but I don't want it to really be a door. So I could put it in there, make it look like a door, parking in between the railings. So a number of opportunities to mess around and confuse Revit. Yeah.
So it's not host-based?
Not hosted. So if I start off with something that's not hosted and I change its category, it's not going to suddenly become hosted and put a host in there. It's going to be unhosted at that point. But the thing that you might have missed is this, work plane based. When the thing is work plane based, then you have the opportunity to specify a plane that it should sit on. This other thing I might as well mention while I'm here is shared. If you want to nest objects, let's say I want to build a bed setting, so a bed, nightstand, lamp, comfy chair. We just talked about comfy chairs earlier today. If I have this conglomeration of stuff, if I build a furniture family, or a generic model family for that matter, and I put these objects in it, and if each of those objects is called shared, this checkbox is checked, when I load it into a project environment, I can schedule each chair, each bed, each nightstand, each lamp as an individual collection, essentially. Or I can schedule the assembly. So I can say I've got 50 king settings and 50 queen settings, or I've got 50 king beds and 50 queen beds. It depends on how I want to set the schedule up. It's very powerful because it allows me to harness this object and this object and this object, put them together, and schedule them all as though they're individuals.
When you're doing that scheduling, do you typically make the grouping a different category than the nested objects? So
Yeah.
you get different groupings?
That's not a bad way to go, unless you really want it to be furniture. Then you just have to filter out the grouping. Yes.
I was looking at families and symbols. Is there any way to show on a symbol legend, make the distinction between existing and
I don't think the symbol, the legend feature inside Revit supports that yet. So most people are just drawing object placing is just a.
And what about schedules? Not be the widths be changed somewhere so
No, there's no way to nest a symbol in the schedule yet. But you can make the column wider than it needs to be, and leaving a little space at the end. Just talking about taking like a door symbol, I assume, or a window symbol, and being able to place it next to the row so that you see the symbol. Schedules, unfortunately, from a graphical presentation format are lacking. At least the information's there. Hopefully they'll make it much better as time goes by. Yeah.
How about the issue of standard curtain walls? Like, I've read some workarounds. That's the better we go back. Is there a tutorial somewhere that?
You're talking about being able to schedule the curtain wall itself, or the panels, or treat the panels as windows?
Or you building a curtain wall in a window family and trying to schedule those pieces.
Yeah.
So you're basically building a giant window.
With a family, but it's a curtain wall assembly.
So can you schedule the, say, the panes of glass and all these separately, right? Is that what you're looking at?
Well, if you schedule, let's say you build large windows and then you reconstruct them, do that in this, the town for those big windows. Where, obviously you can't schedule.
You can schedule the objects, but again, it comes down to, I mean, if you're, I'm not sure I understand the question. Why are they not using the curtain wall tool for that? Because you could schedule mullions, panels, and curtain wall as a wall essentially. So it's a question of, how did they come to the decision? Why did they take the route they took? And then I'd probably be able to answer the question. We can take it offline and explain a little more if you like. Any others? I don't want to keep you here. Probably have lives.
So yeah, we'll just take a quick kind of wrap up. You guys can obviously stay, like Steve or whatever, but I just wanted to thank all of you for coming. I'm Chris Duke, if you didn't meet me last time, or the James Management, we have to leave there. We want to thank Steve for stopping by and sharing his expertise with us.
Disjointed.
What's that?
Sorry, it's a little disjointed.
No, that's great. It's good. I think you do a job of balancing kind of basics with advanced topics.
How many people are still bewildered? As quickly as I went, I can't believe that only 2 admitted to the bewildered.
There's plenty of questions.
I honestly prefer the give and take because the things that you're running through, I can explain something and miss it completely. But if you ask the question, at least you get a chance to address it. So hopefully we did.
So good game for Steve.